In 1932, the Great Depression entered its third winter. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed, marking the highest unemployment rate in the country's history. Tens of thousands had lost their homes and life savings, and there was very little confidence that Republican President Herbert Hoover could turn things around. So when the election came, voters flocked to his Democratic competitor. Franklin D. Roosevelt promised a New Deal for Americans, a comprehensive set of legislation to support struggling citizens and put the country back to work. The massive federal intervention Roosevelt proposed was a radical challenge to the individualist ideals that governed many Americans' lives. But due to the extreme circumstances, he began his presidency with public and political support. With the help of his advisors, Roosevelt's first 100 days in office were perhaps the most eventful of any U.S. president. In just over 3 months, he pushed over 15 bills through Congress and created an alphabet soup of government agencies to help farmers, workers, and businesses. The New Deal's first priority was stabilizing the banks. Over the previous 3 years, many Americans had withdrawn their savings out of fear the bank would lose their money in bad investments. So to regain the public's confidence, FDR increased federal oversight of commercial banks and created bank insurance to guarantee that any deposited funds would always be available. Next, he established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. FERA cataloged each state's need for relief and provided funds to help citizens afford groceries, rent, clothing, coal, and other necessities. Meanwhile, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration subsidized farmers and educated them in improving planting techniques. These policies fed and housed thousands, but they didn't significantly address the New Deal's biggest promise, reducing unemployment. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was established to employ over 250,000 young men for projects like tree planting, irrigation, and fire prevention. The CCC offered on-site work camps that provided food, shelter, and education to those employed, mostly young, single men with families in need of relief. Subsequent programs like the Works Progress Administration and the Tennessee Valley Authority added projects building roads, bridges, and hydroelectric dams. The WPA also funded art, writing, and theater programs. These initiatives cut civilian unemployment in half, and they did so alongside labor acts that abolished child labor, granted unions the right to collective bargaining, and set the first national minimum wage. Benefits were also created to help those unable to work. The Social Security Act established an old age pension system in addition to unemployment insurance, disability benefits, and welfare assistance. But despite these sweeping policies, the New Deal helped some groups more than others. Black Americans were hit hardest by the economic downturn, and the New Deal's impact on Black communities varied widely. In northern cities like Chicago, Black citizens received a large share of jobs, vocational training, and education, with New Deal programs teaching more than 1 million Black Americans to read. Northern Black communities also received an influx of public housing, though it was heavily segregated. In the South, results were less positive. Roosevelt relied heavily on the support of Southern Democrats. who welcomed economic development but fought to preserve white supremacy. They ensured that new labor laws excluded domestic servants and agricultural workers, occupations held by many Black Americans. These politicians and many others also undermined Eleanor Roosevelt's attempts to push her husband toward supporting a federal anti-lynching law. As a result, the New Deal has often been called a raw deal for Black communities, and many modern inequities in housing, employment, and financial stability are partially due to New Deal programs prioritizing white Americans. In these ways and more, the New Deal didn't fully live up to its promises. Despite employing over 8 million Americans, unemployment never went lower than 14%, and the U.S. economy wouldn't fully recover until the country's mobilization for World War II. But this bold campaign of progressive policies did empower unions to start their own revolution. In the coming decades, Northern liberals, Black Americans, and other working minorities united to fight discriminatory hiring. In the process, they reshaped the Democratic Party, challenging its racist leadership and laying the groundwork for an emerging civil rights coalition.
On the poverty thing, I want to say that this is not going to solve poverty. 30 years ago, Roosevelt talked about the 1/3. Today, we're talking about the 1/5. But it is a beginning. And as President Kennedy said, let us begin. And this is a beginning. And if it works, as the Peace Corps works, then we'll improve it. If it doesn't, we'll correct it. But let us begin.
I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished.
This war on poverty is the longest battle we have faced as a nation. Over 50 years ago, we began a new march against poverty. New leaders, new ways to fight this battle, born out of a spirit of community, of the individual. A framework to expand economic opportunity, to do much more than we had done in the past, in new ways to rebuild our neighborhoods, to create jobs and businesses. Programs, yes, but also people working together. Inspired people, inspiring agencies, pioneers in our communities. We pushed new frontiers. Pursuing community-driven action, embracing economic development, education, housing. Millions have risen out of poverty. Over time, we tested new ideas. As we confronted new challenges in our families, our communities, our jobs, we stay constant, driven by the values we have always shared. 50 years later, the legacy endures.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
These 10 people represent everyone in America. This person on the left, she represents the poorest 10% of Americans. And on the right, he is the very richest 10%. So let's ask this group a simple question. What percentage of your income gets taxed? Most Americans pay multiple income taxes to the federal government and state governments and local governments. But a recent analysis by 2 economists added up all the income taxes. And when you do that, the data shows that poor people pay a very small part of their income to the government, and rich people pay more. This concept of taxing the poor at a lower rate and taxing the rich more, this is called progressive taxation. It's how taxes work in most countries. But it's also why some critics question whether these people are getting away without paying their fair share.
The middle class and the poor that pay, if anything, a lot less.
Why is it that 45% of the population of this country is not contributing back to the rest?
But now let's add one more guy to this group of 10. This guy? He represents the 400 richest Americans, billionaires. Billionaires don't make most of their money through typical income, so their income actually gets taxed at lower rates than these less rich people. Now you might be thinking, don't billionaires pay taxes in other ways? And the answer is yes. This is just the income tax, and there are lots of other kinds of taxes in America. And this analysis, where this data came from, it looked at all those taxes. And it shows that when we add them all up, there actually is someone in this group who might not be paying their fair share. Let's go back to our first chart with these 11 people. Remember, this is just the income tax. What happens when we add in all the other taxes? Well, let's look at another kind of tax, corporate and property taxes. These are the taxes we pay on things we own, usually businesses and property, and the money we make on them. Usually rich people own more things, so these corporate and property taxes hit them the hardest. Rich people also tend to be from rich families. And when they inherit a lot of money, the government taxes them. This is called an estate tax. Put these taxes together and it's clear that they place a much heavier burden on the rich, including billionaires. Add these back onto the income taxes, and it looks like the rich really do pay way more than the poor. But now let's talk about another tax. This one's buried in your pay stub. Look closely and you'll see something called a Medicare tax and a Social Security tax. Sometimes pay stubs call them FICA. Anyway, combined, these are called payroll taxes. Medicare and Social Security are 2 really important programs. They provide healthcare and a modest income for when we get old and retire. But they're also expensive, which is why we have these payroll taxes separate from the income tax to pay for them. So on your paycheck, you'll notice that you're taxed 7.65% in payroll taxes. And your company is supposed to pay another 7.65% on your behalf. But economists have found that in practice, the way companies pay their part of the payroll tax is by just paying workers less. So in reality, many workers pay nearly the full 15.3% toward this tax. And everyone is on the hook for the same percentage. But the wealthy? Once someone earns more than about $130,000 a year, the money they make beyond that isn't subject to the Social Security tax. It's capped. That means the rich pay a really small portion of their income toward payroll taxes, and poor people in the middle class pay way more. Add payroll taxes onto this chart, and it starts to flatten out. The last type of taxes we're going to look at are the taxes we pay when we buy stuff. For example, let's say you're looking to buy a t-shirt. When you check out, you pay a sales tax, which is a percentage of its cost. And sales taxes apply to most things: furniture, toilet paper, laundry detergent. For some items like beer and gasoline, there are additional taxes that get incorporated into the price tag before you even get to the store. These are called consumption taxes, and we all pay the same rate on the things we buy, regardless of how rich we are. Now, you might think that since rich people usually buy more things and more expensive things, they pay a larger percentage of their income toward these taxes. But relative to how much money they have, the stuff they buy and the taxes they pay on that stuff take up a relatively small portion of their income. Meanwhile, everyone, even people with almost no money, needs to buy certain basic things to survive. And for poor people, those basic things and the taxes that come with them cost them almost everything they earn. So if we chart how much of their income each of these people pays in consumption taxes, we can see that poor people pay a much larger portion. When we put these taxes together, suddenly we see a big change. The chart shows us that this line from before is a lie. That America's tax system as a whole isn't very progressive. Instead, it's mostly flat. Poor people pay about the same portion of their income in taxes as rich people. And this guy, this billionaire, is paying a smaller portion than everyone else, even the poorest. If you just look at certain types of taxes, it's natural to assume that rich people pay a bigger tax burden in the US, and that poor people aren't exactly paying their fair share. But a more complete look at the bigger picture challenges that. And it suggests that if we're looking for a group that isn't paying their fair share, we might be looking on the wrong end.